Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Aris, and I'm from the Indonesian Foreign Ministry. Thank you for having me today. Today, I'm going to deliver a very short remark upon an issue that I have pondered about, I have researched, I have written, and which was published by a few think tanks around the world. So stay with me for a while, as I will tell you a story about what's happening in the Pacific right now. So recently we've had a lot of breaking news. We have had the rise of coronavirus, we've had the death of Kobe Bryant, and the rise of tension between Iran and the US. But often because of this headline news, we forgot about other issues, sometimes that are overlooked, including what's happening in the Pacific. But before we get to the context of the issue, we have to understand the background of the story. As we all know, Australia is one of the largest contributors of aid in the Pacific, and thus it has a lot of influence in the Pacific. It influences how the Pacific, how they decide things in the Pacific, how they have political views in the Pacific, and this is due to the proximity of Australia to the Pacific, and of course, how Australia see the Pacific as their good neighbors. But recently, this influence in the Pacific and this contribution to the Pacific is seeing a major battle, because China is now expanding itself to the Pacific, something that is probably unprecedented by all of us. The method that China is trying to do this is by exerting what people say the debt trap diplomacy. The debt trap diplomacy, as we all know, is how, in this context, China targets vulnerable countries by giving them loans, by giving them aid for the development of construction, of infrastructure projects, which later are deemed to be unsustainable and are unfeasible. This makes the states be trapped in a debt, which then force them to then further abide to the rules of China. For instance, we have the infamous example of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, in which after the construction of the project was deemed unsuccessful, that it was not gaining the revenue that it was planned to gain, and was not able, and the Sri Lankan government was not able to repay the debt back to China. So, in order to minimize the loss, the Sri Lankan government gave a lease to China, which then China now have the full operation of the port. Of course, this is very concerning to countries, and will be very concerning for countries in the Pacific. But of course, is this going to happen in the Pacific? Well, in fact, we don't know, but there is already proof that that is the way that China is doing business in the Pacific. We have the Vanuatu Conference Center, which China helped build a few years ago. It was expected to be able to host large conference and events, but unfortunately, it never did. It never was able to meet its expectations, and it was gaining a lot of loss. There were no net revenues there, and now, just recently, the government of Vanuatu decided that they are not able to maintain the operation of the conference center, and then they are now planning to even loan more money from China to make sure that the conference center can be effective and more efficient. So there are already proof that this is going to happen in the Pacific. But what does this mean for Indonesia? Well, for Indonesia, the Pacific is a very strategic partner, because there are many things that we and the Pacific have a lot in common, but there are also a lot of things that we and the Pacific have not in common. There are many things that the Pacific have that are different in perspective, and this is something that we need to tackle. Especially when we talk about Indo-Pacific, we keep talking about the Asia and the Indo part of the Pacific, but we are not talking about the Pacific of the Indo-Pacific. And this is something that we need to start to address. Of course, what we can do Well, first, there is always the zero option. We can do nothing, but to do nothing, then we will gain nothing. And if we do nothing, then most likely China will be able to influence these Pacific countries to their own desire, to their own liking, and this may eventually affect us. What we get are probably the negative effects or positive effects, or even the collateral damage from China. Then the second option is, of course, we can go to the Pacific ourselves, and we can rival the proposal from China. So, in other words, we can propose other alternative for the Pacific, so that we can put an influence to the Pacific ourselves. Of course, this is going to be difficult to do because, of course, when it comes to funds, China have, of course, the larger funds between Indonesia and China, and this is going to be difficult to do. But the third option is to make a cooperation between Indonesia and China. So we can create a joint venture, for example, between Indonesia and China, and we could together help build the Pacific together. The concern about this is then, of course, does this mean that Indonesia is now aligned to China? Because that is not something that we want to do. So that is what we can do. But what we should do, I propose, is that we should not opt for one option, but we should go and switch between options depending on the situation. For example, we could, for one instance, we could rival China's proposal in small projects, in projects that are not way beyond the funds available for us. And for another instance, for another example, we could cooperate with China on projects that we deem are beneficial for both of us, for China, for Indonesia, and for the Pacific too. But we just have to bear in mind that we have to scrutinize all of this cooperation, because we don't want the label of the diplomacy of China be labeled on us as well. And of course, we could also switch to the third option. If we think that rivaling China or cooperating with China is unfeasible, we could, of course, do nothing. So my proposal is to make sure that Indonesia still does what it does best, which is becoming a fluid entity, which is becoming an entity that can adapt to situations and can answer to problems as it sees fit. That is my proposal. But is this the end of my story? Well, this is not, because this is but the prologue of my story. As now we will have to discuss upon ourselves what we should do about this, because that is my proposal, and this is not, it is something that we have to make consensus about. So that is my proposal, and thank you for having me today, and thank you very much for your attention.